A homeless woman embraced a crying child, not knowing his millionaire father was watching. The automatic doors of Grand Central Terminal opened with a sharp hiss, letting in thick summer air mixed with the metallic scent of the tracks. Thousands of footsteps echoed through endless corridors, the sound of rolling suitcases, announcements distorted through speakers. It was rush hour, and the crowd seemed like a single living organism, pushing, pressing, impatient. Among all that anonymous mass, a 6-year-old boy tried to hold onto his nanny's hand, a young woman too busy checking her phone to notice how he was starting to fall behind. Michael, small, thin, wearing a freshly pressed white shirt, and a blue backpack too big for his fragile shoulders. Increasingly scared, increasingly distant. At one moment, someone pushed them. Michael lost his balance, and the nanny's hand slipped away. He stumbled over a suitcase, fell to his knees on the hard floor, and felt his eyes fill with tears. When he looked up, she was already too far away, swallowed by the human current. The crying burst out without permission. His backpack opened, letting a notebook and pencil roll across the floor. No one looked at him. No one helped him. Just a constant murmur of "excuse me," and "move aside" as strangers stepped around him, without barely registering his presence. But in a dark corner of the station, sitting on cardboard, someone had seen him. It was Sarah. Her hair fell in dirty strands over her face, and her bare feet hid under a worn dress. With a plastic bag beside her, and a nearly empty water bottle in her hands, she seemed invisible, until the child's sobs cut through the station's cacophony, and reached her. Her eyes searched for him, found him. At first she hesitated. It was better not to get involved in other people's business. That's how you survived. But something deep inside forced her to get up, to hold the bag tightly against her chest, and make her way through the crowd. She knelt in front of him. He barely looked up, tears and snot on his little face flushed from the heat. Sarah dropped the bag to one side, and put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. She just opened her arms with an almost forgotten tenderness, inviting him to come closer. Michael, trembling, did so. He sank into that embrace, as if he had been waiting all afternoon for it. Sarah surrounded him with her thin arms, feeling his small heart beating rapidly against her, and wondered if anyone had ever held him like this. She didn't see the man watching them. At the top of the escalators, stopped halfway between the upper gallery and the platform, stood David Santa Maria, impeccable, in his light gray suit, with his briefcase hanging from his shoulder, and a petrified look on his face. The scene froze his blood. There was his son, in the arms of a homeless woman. But what disarmed him most wasn't the fact itself, but the way Michael embraced her, the way he curled up against her chest, as if there and not with him, was his refuge. The rest of the world disappeared. Only that image remained etched in his memory. His son, his only son, seeking comfort in a broken woman, and that raw, naked tenderness that he himself had been unable to give him. The escalator continued its journey, and people kept passing around him, but David didn't move. He couldn't. Something had awakened in him, something he didn't know if he wanted to feel. If this story has already captivated you in this first moment, subscribe right now, and join us in this unforgettable story of love and redemption. David didn't look away, as the escalator finally deposited him on the platform. He stayed there, motionless, his hand clenched on the handrail, his briefcase hanging uselessly from his wrist. The crowd forced him to step aside, and still he didn't take his eyes off that scene that for some reason, he couldn't understand, hurt him more than it angered him. Michael remained sheltered in that woman's arms. David could see how his son pressed closer to her every time someone passed near, how the small fingers clung to the loose thread of her dress as if it were the only thing keeping him safe. The nanny finally appeared at the other end of the corridor, agitated and panting, shouting Michael's name through the crowd. Her shrill voice broke the intimacy of the scene like splintered glass. Sarah heard her, and instinctively looked down at the child, as if asking permission to let him go. Michael barely moved his head, a slight gesture of refusal that made her smile sadly. But the nanny was already upon them, pushing her away with a sharp gesture, lifting the child in her arms as if she had done something wrong. "How dare you touch him?" she spat, without even looking her in the eyes. Sarah didn't respond. She lowered her gaze and picked up her bag from the floor, her fingers trembling slightly as she stepped back a couple of paces. People had already returned to ignoring her, as always. David didn't intervene, not at that moment. He just followed them with his gaze as the nanny took Michael away, who now turned his head again and again to look at the homeless woman. The child stretched out a hand in her direction, as if he wanted to say goodbye, or maybe stay. That image was etched in David more deeply than any meeting or contract signing he had experienced in his 40 years. He walked after them, not realizing that his steps led him exactly to the same corner where Sarah had been. There was nothing but dirty cardboard and some breadcrumbs on the floor, no trace of her, nothing but a disturbing silence. He bent down and picked up something that had been left behind, a worn handkerchief, embroidered with a name barely visible among the frayed threads. Sarah. He closed his fist around the handkerchief, and felt a lump in his throat. Something in him was changing, though he didn't know how to explain it. That night, in the pristine solitude of his glass penthouse, he couldn't fall asleep. He paced the windows again and again with his hands in his pockets, barely listening to Michael's peaceful breathing in his room, and yet every time he closed his eyes, he didn't think about his son. He thought about her, about the way she held him, about the look with which she looked at him, as if nothing else mattered, as if that broken woman had known how to give him something that he, with all his money, had forgotten years ago how to give. At dawn, still without having slept, he promised himself he would go back to look for her, even if he didn't know what for. The day dawned pale and heavy, with humid heat that fogged the penthouse windows. David still stood facing the windows, his hands resting on the sill, and his gaze lost in the gray horizon of the city. The feeling of unease consumed him from within, a kind of emptiness that no business achievement, no figure or contract could fill. In the adjoining room, Michael was still sleeping, tucked up to his chin. David watched him for a moment from the doorway, feeling a knot in his stomach. The way the child had clung to that woman at the station, that image wouldn't leave him alone. He couldn't remember the last time his son had hugged him like that. He couldn't remember the last time he himself had tried to offer it. When the nanny arrived to take care of the daily routine, he left without warning. He went down to the garage, started his black car, and immersed himself in the still sleepy streets of New York, letting his instincts guide him. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to find her. He returned to Grand Central, convinced she would still be there, in her dark corner, but there was no one, no trace of her figure, nor her bag, nor the cardboard, where she had been sitting. The plaza seethed with the human tide, as always, indifferent to the previous night's drama. He stopped to observe every homeless person, every woman dressed in rags, wondering if it was her, but none returned that sweet and hard look at the same time. None awakened that strange shiver in his neck. He walked for hours. He toured alleys, street markets, the underbelly he had never stepped foot in his life. And although he felt out of place among so much misery, something inside him pushed him to keep searching. Noon found him in a small neighborhood square, leaning against a lamppost, his hands buried in his pockets, and his shirt stuck to his body from the heat. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to drown the growing frustration that gripped him. Suddenly, he heard a familiar murmur. A child, not his this time, was crying in a corner. A woman leaned over him, murmuring soft words, offering him a piece of bread. David recognized the cadence of her voice before even seeing her face. It was her, Sarah, with her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her skirt still dusty, but with that same light in her gaze, that same impossible tenderness to ignore. David didn't move. He stayed there, watching her from afar, as if getting too close might break the spell, as if observing her like this was the only way to hold something inside him that he still didn't dare name. For the first time in years he didn't think about unanswered emails, or the day's tight schedule. He only thought about her, and about how the hell he would approach her. Sarah leaned a little more, placing the piece of bread in the child's small hands. who looked at her with big wet eyes, between grateful and distrustful. She smiled barely, that sad smile David already knew, the same one his son had seen first, that smile, that for some reason, he couldn't get out of his mind. He waited for the child to run away to his mother, who was waiting a few meters away in a hurry. Sarah was alone again, picking up the crumbs that had fallen on her skirt, arranging her bag with almost ritual delicacy. It was then that David took a step forward. He had no plan. He hadn't even rehearsed what to say.
He just felt that if he didn't do it at that moment, he never would.
She saw him approaching, and her eyes narrowed with suspicion. It was impossible not to notice the difference. His suit, his impeccable bearing, his watch shining in the sun. He wasn't from there. He wasn't like the others. But she didn't back away either.
"Sis.
"Hello," he said finally, his voice lower than he expected. Sarah studied him for a second, before responding with a dry, "What do you want?" There was no sweetness in her tone, no fear either. It was the voice of someone accustomed to people approaching her, only out of pity, or to bother her.
"Sis." David hesitated,
surprised by the crudeness of that gaze. He felt his throat dry, and an uncomfortable pressure in his chest. "I just wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for what you did yesterday."
"With my son."
Sarah raised her eyebrows, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "I didn't do it for you," she responded after a moment, lowering her gaze to continue arranging her bag. David remained there, feeling the weight of each word, not knowing quite how to continue. No one had ever disarmed him like this. "I know," he admitted. Finally, with a rough voice, Sarah looked up for the first time, looking him directly in the eyes, and in her gaze David felt something that burned him inside. Dignity, not pleading, not resentment, just dignity. He wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. And before he could articulate another excuse to stay, Sarah stood up, hung the bag over her shoulder, and began to walk away with slow, sure steps. David followed her with his gaze, motionless, until he saw her disappear among the people in the square, wrapped in that air of mystery that both intrigued and disconcerted him. He stayed there, alone, feeling a strange emptiness in his stomach, an emptiness he didn't remember feeling since his wife's death. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself wondering why that embrace, why that woman, why he, with all his money, and all his success, now felt smaller than ever in front of someone who had nothing. Why when she looked him in the eyes, he felt she had truly seen him. David returned to the car with heavy steps, not even remembering how he had gotten there. He sat behind the wheel, his hand still trembling on the cold leather, and for the first time in years he wasn't in a hurry to start up. He closed his eyes, and rested his head on the backrest, letting the image of her, the way she walked away without looking back, with the bag hanging from her shoulder, pierce him like a sting. The sensation wasn't familiar. It was something between frustration and curiosity, a stab of something deeper, impossible to define. He had never had to beg for anyone's attention. His presence, his surname, his money, had always been enough to open any door, to earn any glance. But that woman had looked at him as if he didn't exist. The idea drove him crazy, and at the same time, drew him more toward her. That afternoon, instead of returning to work, he decided to stay in the area, hoping to see her again. He parked on a side street, with the windows slightly open to let in the warm dusty breeze, and stayed there for hours. He saw her again near the neighborhood market, exchanging words with a fruit vendor, picking up some fruit scraps he handed her with indifference. Then she sat on a plaza bench, splitting a peach in half with her hands, and eating it slowly, as if the world around her didn't exist. There was something in that calm that disarmed him. In that way of not asking for anything, not expecting anything, of simply being. David didn't dare approach again. He just observed her from a distance, feeling that with every minute that passed he knew her a little more, and yet knew nothing about her. When night fell, Sarah got up and disappeared among the narrow streets, her silhouette dissolving in the shadows. David followed her with his gaze, until he lost her completely. That night, back in his penthouse, he couldn't get her out of his thoughts. Michael was already sleeping, and he stayed by his room door, watching him sleep. The child moved in his dreams and murmured something, barely a whisper. David leaned in, trying to understand, but all he managed to hear was one word: Sarah. He felt his stomach close up. His son was also thinking about her. David left the room and closed the door carefully. He stayed leaning in the hallway, looking at the floor, his hands in his pockets, and for the first time in a long time, he felt an impulse he didn't know how to control. He had to see her again. He had to understand who she was, what there was in her that awakened in his son, and in himself, something so strong, so impossible to ignore. The next day, he returned to the same neighborhood, determined to talk to her, even though he had no idea what to say to her this time. The neighborhood streets slowly awakened that morning, with the aroma of fresh bread escaping from bakeries, and vendors setting up their stalls in the market. The air was warm, but you could already sense the merciless sun that would fall at noon. David arrived early, parking in the same spot as the day before. He stayed in the car for a long while, watching how people began their routine. Children running to school, elderly people with their cloth bags, merchants shouting their offers. The city had a different rhythm there, a pulse he had never noticed, too accustomed to his offices, his meetings, his ordered and predictable life. And then he saw her. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the fountain, with her skirt rolled up a bit to dry her bare feet in the sun. She had her hair up this time, revealing a thin neck and a profile that seemed younger under that soft light. Beside her, a bag of bread and a book with worn covers that she leafed through delicately. David got out of the car before thinking twice. This time, she noticed him long before he spoke. She looked up from the book when she felt his shadow projected over the fountain. She looked at him steadily, without surprise, as if she knew that sooner or later, he would come looking for her again. "You again," she murmured, with a hint of irony in her voice. David sat on the opposite edge of the fountain, leaving a prudent space between them. He remained silent for a few seconds, looking at the clear water where coins glittered at the bottom. "I don't know why I'm here," he admitted finally, almost in a whisper. Sarah narrowed her eyes, evaluating his words. She closed the book and left it on her knees. "Then leave," she responded, without harshness, but also without sweetness. David let out a small bitter laugh. "I don't want to leave," he said, and for the first time he dared to look at her directly. "Last night I couldn't sleep, thinking about you, thinking about my son." She lowered her gaze, uncomfortable, and played with the edge of her skirt. "I just did what anyone would do," she said finally, but there was something more in her voice, something he noticed, even though she tried to hide it, a crack. David leaned a little toward her, as if he wanted to see beyond her silence. "No, Sarah, not anyone would have done it." She looked at him then, and for the first time that morning, her expression changed. For an instant something vulnerable appeared in her eyes, something she couldn't contain completely, as if those words had reminded her of something she had long buried. Silence settled between them, loaded with unanswered questions. David didn't insist, he just stayed there, looking at her, trying to understand what was behind that fierce dignity, behind that quiet sadness, and as he walked away to leave her alone, he knew that was just the first layer. That woman still kept stories he wasn't ready to hear yet, but he would hear them, one way or another, because for the first time in his life, he was willing to stay as long as it took to truly know someone. And you? Have you ever felt that a stranger looked at you more deeply than anyone? Tell us in the comments. David's visits to the neighborhood became an undeclared routine. Every morning, after making sure Michael was at school, he would drive aimlessly until ending up in the same plaza, with the car parked in the shade, observing Sarah's movements from afar. She seemed to pay him no attention. She continued sitting on the same bench by the fountain, reading her book, eating stale bread, or picking up scraps in the market corners. But despite her apparent indifference, David noticed that her eyes followed him sometimes, fleetingly, when she thought he wasn't looking. The first gesture came on a cloudy Tuesday, when David, seeing her asking for water at the corner stand, went ahead and paid for a cold bottle before she spoke. Sarah looked at him without thanking, took the bottle with her fingertips and walked away. but this time she didn't return the bottle or leave it at the fountain, as she had done before. The next day it was a small package with sandwiches wrapped in paper. He left it on the bench when she got up and waited, at a distance, for her to return and find it. Sarah stopped, looked at it for a few seconds, and took it without opening it. They were clumsy gestures, rehearsals of something deeper that David didn't yet know how to express. One afternoon, it was drizzling, and the sky darkened early.
Chiz.
David followed her, as she walked toward an improvised shelter under a bridge, where several homeless people huddled to protect themselves from the rain. There he saw her sitting on the ground, helping to bandage an old man's wounded foot, carefully cleaning another's wounds. The scene moved him in a strange and painful way. He didn't understand how someone with so little could give so much. The next day, he dared to sit next to her at the fountain again. "You should have a roof at least for the nights," he said softly, after a long silence. Sarah barely turned her head to look at him. "And you're going to give it to me?" she asked, with a raised eyebrow.
David swallowed,
surprised by the frankness in her voice. "If you accept it," he murmured. "Sincere." She smiled sadly. "I already have one," she responded, pointing with her gaze to the sky. "Even if it's not as comfortable as yours." That answer left him speechless. He felt something in his chest breaking slowly, like a crack that widened more and more. And yet, each day that passed, he felt less fear of that crack, because for the first time in a long time, that crack made him feel human again. That afternoon the plaza was almost empty, and the heavy sky announced a storm. David arrived as always, in silence, taking a seat on the edge of the fountain, close but without invading her space. Sarah absently leafed through her book, though she wasn't really reading. For the first time in weeks, she spoke first.
"Why do you keep coming?"
she asked, without looking up from the pages. "What do you expect to find?" David breathed deeply, feeling how each of his words always seemed like a challenge he had to cross. "I don't know," he admitted, sincere. "Maybe I just want to understand you." She let out a brief, almost bitter laugh, and slowly closed the book. "There's nothing to understand," she said, leaving the volume on her lap. "I'm just one more, one who's surplus." "I don't believe that," he replied immediately, firmly. Sarah raised her eyes for the first time, and looked at him for a long time, as if searching for a hidden lie in him, but she found none. Then after a dense silence, she began to speak. "Before, I didn't live here. I lived in a nicer neighborhood, with big windows and white curtains. I had a small garden, full of lavender. I liked to sit there to read when evening fell." David barely moved. Each word from her kept him stiller, more captive. "I was married," she continued, her voice low. "It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And one night, while he slept, I woke up to the smell of smoke. The house was burning. Everything was gone in a matter of minutes. The white curtains, the lavender, him too, and I didn't know where to go after." The last words were lost in a murmur. Sarah turned her gaze toward the fountain, as if the water could erase the tremor from her lips. "After that, nothing made sense," she whispered. "There was no one left, nowhere to sleep, no desire to start over. Just nothing." David felt an immense weight in his chest. He leaned a little toward her, with an impulse he barely managed to contain. He didn't want to touch her yet. He didn't want to say anything that might break that confession. She breathed deeply, and after a few seconds, resumed her usual mask. "There's nothing more to tell," she said finally, as if closing a book before time. "So don't waste your time here." But David didn't get up. "I'm not leaving," he responded simply. She didn't look at him, but her fingers played nervously with the edge of the book. There was something in her silence that didn't sound like rejection, but fear. A fear of trusting again, fear of believing in someone's goodness again. And David understood it, because he felt the same thing himself. For the first time in many years, there was someone who reminded him that not everything could be bought, that not all wounds healed with money, that dignity, humanity, were earned with presence. That afternoon, he said nothing more. He just stayed there, next to her, watching the first drops of rain fall on the empty plaza, because sometimes staying is the deepest way of saying, I'm here." The drops grew in intensity, and soon the rain turned the plaza into a brilliant tapestry of puddles and reflections. Sarah didn't move. David didn't either. Sitting next to each other, they seemed like two solitary islands, clinging to a silence that, far from being uncomfortable, was beginning to seem necessary. When the rain subsided, David was the first to speak. "I also lost something," he said, barely a murmur, without looking at her. Sarah glanced at him sideways, her fingers still clutching the closed book on her knees. He kept his gaze fixed on the fountain water, as if confessing was easier if there were no eyes on him. "My wife," he continued. "She died 4 years ago, a car accident. I was traveling, signing contracts in another city. When they called me, it was too late." His voice broke slightly, but he did nothing to hide it. Sarah listened in silence, without moving a single muscle. "I was left alone with Michael." His hand tensed on the fountain's edge. "And I thought I had everything under control, that I could move forward, but the more I tried to do right by him, the more I distanced myself. I became a stranger to my own son." David inhaled deeply, letting out a trembling sigh. "When I saw him in your arms," he continued, "I felt something inside me breaking, as if he had found, in seconds with you, something I never knew how to give him." The silence that followed his confession was long and dense, but not uncomfortable. Sarah continued, looking at him sideways, and for the first time in a long time, her eyes showed no distrust, but something more like understanding. "That doesn't make you a worse father," she said finally, with a soft voice, almost inaudible. David turned his head, surprised by her words. She didn't smile, but her expression was less hard, less hermetic than usual. "It just makes you human," she added. The words hit him deep, more than he would have expected. For an instant, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders, one more crack that widened, letting in some light. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. He didn't need to say anything more. Sarah didn't either. They stayed there, listening to the rain completely stop, and the first timid rays of sun begin to filter through the clouds. The plaza remained empty, but on that bench there was something different. A quiet promise, a truce between two broken souls who, without knowing it, had begun to find each other. David looked down at the book between her hands, and pointed to it, with a half smile. "Would you lend it to me someday?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, as if wanting to remind him that she still didn't trust him. But this time she didn't look away, nor hide that slight gleam in her eyes, almost imperceptible, almost an invitation. And although she didn't say it out loud, David knew he wouldn't leave until he read every page of the story she hid in her silence. The following days brought an unexpected cold, one of those currents of icy air that fall on the city like a silent threat. David continued going every morning to the plaza, but Sarah didn't appear. He looked for her on the same benches, under the bridge, in the market, and nothing. Only the remains of her presence remained, a crumpled cardboard under the fountain, a forgotten bag in a corner. Her absence became a weight in David's chest. Something inside him stirred with every minute that passed without seeing her. He had learned, in silence, to count the days based on that look of hers, on that half smile that appeared only when he didn't expect it. He finally found her on the third day, at nightfall, in the back alley of the market. She was huddled against the wall, her back slid down to the floor, her skirt soaked by rain and her breathing labored. "Sarah," David murmured, kneeling beside her. She opened her eyes with effort. Her skin was ashen, and she was sweating cold, but even so she tried to push him away weakly with her hand. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just a cold." But she wasn't fine. David felt a lump in his throat when he touched her burning forehead, and noticed how her body trembled like a leaf. Without thinking twice, he took her in his arms. He felt how light she was, how fragile, and in that instant, something in him changed. The man who until recently had never stopped for anyone but himself, now held in his arms a broken woman who had nothing, and whom he was no longer willing to lose. He took her to a small neighborhood hotel, and urgently requested a room. He didn't want to attract attention by taking her to his penthouse. nor subject her to the judgment of his world yet. There, in a simple bed, he tucked her in with clean blankets, and covered her with a delicacy he didn't remember ever having. He spent the night beside her, sitting in a chair, changing the cold water compresses on her forehead, listening to the disconnected murmurs she let escape between dreams, loose words, names he didn't recognize. At dawn, when she finally opened her eyes and found him there, David felt something breaking inside him. Sarah looked at him for a long time, and although she was weak, her gaze was no longer one of distrust. There was a mute question in it, a crack of something like hope. "Why?" she whispered, with a hoarse voice. David didn't know what to answer. He just took her hand in his and held it tightly, as if that were all the possible answer. Because at that moment, he himself realized he was no longer there out of compassion, nor redemption, nor even for his son. He was there for her, for the woman who had looked at him like no one before, for the woman who had taught him what it was to feel human again. If this scene touched your heart as much as it did ours in telling it, don't forget to leave your like, because small gestures are what change the world. The following days were a slow awakening for Sarah. Every morning, when the sun filtered through the modest hotel window, she found David sitting in the same chair next to the bed, with marked dark circles, and his gaze fixed on her, as if he feared she would disappear at any moment. At first, their words were few: a "how do you feel?" accompanied by a glass of water, and "eat a little," with a tray of hot soup, and she responded with small gestures, barely a murmur, barely a nod. But as the days progressed and the fever faded, Sarah returned to holding his gaze.
Sometimes.
She even let escape a slight smile when he made some clumsy comment to break the silence. "And I choose in the nether. It sold a tournament of Cloldren Stetsil Bertapers." David had changed. He was no longer the man in the impeccable suit she had met in the plaza. Now his shirts were wrinkled, his beard grew carelessly, and his hands, those hands that seemed made only for signing contracts, were warm and firm when holding hers. One afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit by the window, he observed her for a long time without saying anything. Then he got up from the chair, and approached, resting his hands on the frame while looking outside, at the street bustle. "I don't want you to leave," he murmured, almost not daring to look at her. Sarah observed him in silence. She could notice the weight of those words in his voice, in the tension of his shoulders, in how he avoided her eyes, as if he feared the answer. "You have your world," she responded softly, after a long silence, "and I don't." David turned toward her. On his face there was something new, not arrogance, not pride, but a mute plea. "I don't care about your world," he said, taking another step toward her. "I care about you." Sarah felt something inside her trembling. She knew that confession came from a sincere place, and yet, the fear was still there, the fear of losing everything again. She looked away, and let her fingers play with the dress's edge. Her silence was almost as eloquent as words. David didn't insist. He just leaned a little toward her, touched her shoulder gently, and whispered, "You don't have to decide now. Just don't disappear." And she, for the first time, didn't reject that contact. She remained motionless under his hand, her gaze fixed on the sky that lit up at sunset, feeling how something very deep inside her broke and rebuilt at the same time. Maybe she still couldn't promise anything, but deep down, she knew that, for the first time in years, she wanted to stay, even if just a little longer. The day dawned with a clear sky, as if the previous week's storm had swept away, not only the clouds, but also the shadows of their story. Sarah could now walk alone around the hotel room, her steps still somewhat unsteady but increasingly firm. David, as every morning, waited for her sitting in the chair by the window, observing her with the stillness of someone who knows that patience is the only fair price for what's worth waiting for. That morning she was the one who broke the silence. "I'm leaving today," she said, with a serene voice, like someone announcing an inevitable truth. David looked up, his expression imperturbable, only in appearance. Inside, the phrase hit him like a bucket of ice water. "Where to?" he asked, almost fearing the answer. Sarah shrugged. with that sad half-smile he already knew so well. "Wherever my feet take me, where I don't get in the way." He got up slowly, walked to her, and stopped in front of her fragile but defiant figure. He looked at her for a long time, his hands buried in his pockets, as if measuring each word before pronouncing it. "You don't get in the way here," he said finally, with a low but firm voice. Sarah raised her eyes to him. For a moment their gazes intertwined in a deep silence, and in that silence, David understood that the time to choose had come. He took a breath, and stepped closer. "Stay," he murmured. "I'm not asking for anything else, just stay." She lowered her gaze, hesitating, feeling fear pulling her backward, but something inside her, something stronger than fear, pushing her toward him. And then, like someone surrendering to their own heart, Sarah nodded slightly. "For now," she whispered. "I'll stay, for now." David smiled, for the first time in years, a full, sincere smile that filled his face. He needed nothing more than that small "for now," that was in reality the first brick of a different future. When they left the hotel together, the city was already teeming with life under the sun. Michael was waiting for them in the plaza, playing with a ball on the fountain's edge. Upon seeing her, the child ran towards Sarah, and clung to her waist with clean, happy laughter. She lifted him in her arms, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to laugh too without reservations. David watched them both and, as the three of them walked through the plaza, he knew he was no longer alone. That somehow unexpectedly, he had found in the woman who had nothing, the only thing he had always lacked. In the end it wasn't his achievements, or his surname, that defined him, but the capacity to open his heart, even when it seemed impossible. And as the afternoon fell over New York, David understood that sometimes salvation comes disguised as a homeless woman, with an embrace at any station, that life always finds a way to teach us to love again. If this story moved you as much as it did us in telling it, subscribe to our channel, comment on which part touched your heart the most, and share it so more people remember that we all deserve a second chance. Thank you for joining us. Until here.